Hello, my name is Jeremy Collins, the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National WWII Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. Thank you for joining us for today's very important webinar that will cover the uprising at Treblinka. Today marks the 80th anniversary of that uprising, and we have three wonderful young scholars with us who will share their latest findings and thoughts. Leading the conversation will be my colleague and friend, Dr. Jason Dawsey. Jason received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2013 and specializes in the history of the European left, the impact of technology on modern life, and the Holocaust. He has co-edited, along with Dr. Günter Bischoff, a book on the life of Günther Anders. In his most recent article, Rethinking Red Vienna at a Moment of Transition, was just published in Contemporary Austrian Studies. Jason joins us here at the museum as our Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency resident fellow in 2017 and became our research historian in 2019. As our research historian, he works with our partnership with Arizona State University for our online World War II master's degree program. He writes numerous articles and hosts numerous public programs, including many webinars, and has been involved in our travel programs. So with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Dr. Jason Dawsey. Jason?
Jeremy, thank you very much. Let me welcome everyone to this webinar, really this very special anniversary commemorating the Treblinka Uprising, a story of resistance and remembrance, and just honored to have the chance to speak to a couple of not only colleagues, but friends who are experts on Treblinka, and are really going to talk about this camp, its place in the larger history of the Nazi genocide, and this really extraordinary case of resistance, one of the major instances of resistance, Jewish resistance, European resistance, however you want to approach it, from the Second World War in general. So I'm going to introduce the two of them here, and then we're going to get into a series of questions that I think will throw some light on the Treblinka Uprising. First is Jacob Flaws, who is an assistant teaching professor at Arizona State University. I think many of you in the audience know that the museum has a very close partnership with Arizona State, running a World War II online master's program in World War II studies. And that's actually how I got to meet Jacob and got to know him, is through that partnership. So he teaches in this World War II studies master's program, and I hope many of you will seek out information about that. That program is based in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. He's also a faculty affiliate in the Department of History, the Center for Jewish Studies, and the Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies. He earned his bachelor's degree at Buena Vista University, a master's at Iowa State, and PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder. Very excited to announce that Jacob's forthcoming book with the University of Nebraska Press will be published next year, 2024, is entitled Spaces of Treblinka, Retracing a Death Camp. And the book will chart contemporary experiences of Jewish, Polish, German, and Ukrainian witnesses in order to reconstruct the overlapping spatial layers that once comprised the death camp. Also joined today, delighted to say, by Chad Gibbs, who is an assistant professor of Jewish Studies and director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston. Just a wonderful city for those who haven't had the chance to visit Charleston yet. Chad is a historian of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and war in society. He is currently working on a book as well that analyzes geography, gender, and social networks in Jewish resistance at Treblinka. He is also an oral historian and an affiliated researcher at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and a scholar interviewer with the USC Shoah Foundation. Jacob and Chad, great to see you both. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here and to get to have this opportunity alongside Jacob.
This is really something we've been talking about for a matter of months, and it's so great to see it come together. So, Chad and Jacob, there's always a question with something this difficult when you're looking at the subject matter. And let's just say it, I think is often quite unfamiliar to American audiences. Treblinka is a name that some Americans might know, but often don't know a lot about. Auschwitz-Birkenau tends to be the camp connected to the Nazi genocide that most Americans know. That in and of itself would be an interesting thing to know why it has claimed so much attention. But here we're going to really get into some detail about Treblinka and why, making the case obviously why Americans should know much more about it than they do, and often what they even encounter when they see discussions of the Holocaust. So with that said, where to start? Why not start with really the book that for many scholars who work on the Holocaust, for the two of you, has been indispensable. And that's Yitzhak Arad's Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, the Operation Reinhard death camps. Here's my old copy of it for those who are curious. First published with Indiana University Press in 1987, and then a revised and expanded edition came out in 2018. It's still the major study in English of these Operation Reinhard camps, of which Treblinka was one of those. So Chad, we're going to start with you with this one, beginning with Arad's work. So what I'd like to ask here is, what do you think is important to know about Arad's monograph, and how do you think we should evaluate it now that it's more than 35 years since it first appeared?
Yeah, I think I'd start with Arad himself. He was such an amazing human being. He's with us until recently. Unfortunately, he's passed away now. But he's a survivor himself. He's a leader at Yad Vashem. He's a brigadier general in the IDF. Just an amazing life, brilliant scholar. And I think one of the more wowing moments of getting to work on Treblinka is that I think I've actually seen Yitzhak Arad's own handwriting in the margins of documents at Yad Vashem, writing in Hebrew and taking little notes here and there. I think only the archivist gets away with writing on the archival document. So I think that's Arad that left that behind. But that first book, 87 and now 2018, it really is, it's this authoritative account of all three camps. What did Nazi Germany want these camps to do? How did they come about? Where do they fit into the Shoah? And what were their operations supposed to be like? And how does Treblinka fit into that, as if you want to say the third to open, the most refined of the three? You can always see the design similarities between Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, but Treblinka perhaps is the one that kind of gets as close to what they wanted the camps to function like as all three. And I think Arad's work being released again in 2018, I had the opportunity to review the two of them together when that came out in 2018. And reading the both of them side by side, it's clear that he's not needed to update the core research to remain that sort of highest mountain in the field on these three works. It's really that it's been resituated in an evolving Holocaust historiography. It's put back into what do we think of the role of Aktion Reinhard. That's the name over all three of these camps. And then the core research is pretty much unchanged. So that's where Jacob first and then me following after will come into this, is that about 40 years later, there's room for new findings, pretty much in a methodological, and I also make the argument in a sources sense. So I think that's where we pick up Arad.
Thank you, Chad. I mean, that really, this notion of new findings and where you build on Arad, where you differ, but no doubt he's always a reference point. Jacob, your thoughts on Arad's book?
Yeah, everything Chad said is relevant today. And I think that's the really big thing for me, is that word relevance. I think it speaks to Arad's methodology, his groundbreaking approach to treating these three camps, that it's still the work on the Reinhard camps, on certainly Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. I think for me, when I approach Arad's work, the thing that resonates is his sources still make an impact today. He's looking at German perspective, Jewish perspective, and Polish perspective. He's interviewing the train station master at Treblinka, an outside witness that maybe would have been overlooked in the historiography up until 87 when it came out. I think we also have to situate his original release of this book in 87 with the rest of the history that's going on at that point. Certainly in the United States, we're still very much in the midst of the Cold War at that point. And we have a American-centric, a Western-centric view of World War II and the Holocaust and Shoah. And, high up in that language is places like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, even Auschwitz to an extent. But we have to remember the Reinhard camps were all well behind the German or the Soviet sphere of influence after the start of the Cold War. They were torn down before the end of the war, unlike these other camps, which the Allies were able to uncover relatively intact. And so this is almost a chance for the world to first get introduced to some of these things on a very academic level. I also like to pair this book that Arad put out with Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which comes out about the same time. That's this epic, long 9-hour long documentary of sorts, just masterpiece really, where he's going into these areas. He's looking at some of these camps as well. And he's doing it from a perspective that people are going to relate to in terms of video interviews with witnesses. He's walking around the sites that were there. And I think that piques the interest. And Arad's book coming out about the same time gives the scholarly approach. So I think that 1-2 punch in the 80s, the mid to late 80s, I think is kind of this eye-opening experience for a lot of people in the West who really picture the Holocaust as something far different than these three death camps. And we'll talk more about, how those look, how those function differently than some of the other camps. But the Western imagination, I don't think really fully grasped the depth of kind of the darkest parts of the Holocaust.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that, or kind of point out something that Jacob was saying in there. That part of the sources novelty of Arad is that he's a bit before the turn toward oral histories and listening to Jewish survivors. Early Holocaust historians, including Jewish survivors themselves, went straight to the German documents and thought of that as the most authoritative and maybe in a lot of cases only way to get at this history. Arad, probably because of his subject matter and what was even available to him, he's willing to make that turn toward listening to the witness a lot earlier than some other historians and definitely some other topics.
Thank you for this fascinating perspective on the book. I mean, you both kind of pointed out that the book itself is the last decade of the Cold War. And so already things by 1987 are starting to change there, but will be dramatic implications for the opening up of Soviet archives, later on. But that Arad's work is right there in that. And it's such an amazing book. It's obviously for our audience out there, it's a very demanding book. I mean, he confronts some just horrifying subject matter, but what you learn from him is incredible. And just to kind of reiterate what's been brought up already, Arad himself had been a partisan during World War II, a figure in Jewish resistance activity in Eastern Europe. He writes a memoir, in fact, about that several years before the book on the Operation Reinhard camp. So those are interested in Arad's own life and activity during this, what happens to family of his during the genocide, his book, The Partisan, will certainly be of interest to you. Chad and Jacob, now that you've given us some framework for thinking about this major book and then how the two of you are going to build off of it, I think the next thing we'd want to do for our audience is provide some orientation about Operation Reinhard, this term that's in both editions of Arad's book. So when we say this term, Operation Reinhard, could we give an overview? And then Jacob, we'll start with you on this one, an overview of what this Operation Aktion Reinhard or Operation Reinhard, what this was, and how we can relate it to something I think our audience is more familiar with, the January 1942 Wannsee Conference. How can we bring these things together for them? Jacob?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So Action Reinhard is really the culmination from the German perspective of what they have seen as, actually, I would argue, final solutions to the Jewish problem, as they would call it, lowercase f, lowercase s. A lot of the former intentionalist versus functionalist debate on the Holocaust, the former saying it was Hitler's goal all along to exterminate Jews, the latter saying that the process evolved. I think historians kind of agreed somewhere in the middle there, that Hitler certainly is important to understand in terms of who the target was and why they were targeted, but the actual way that this looked, the shootings, death camps, that was the functionalist aspect of this. So if we go back to even 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and then 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union, you see the initial phase is concentration of the Jewish people, and they put them into ghettos. They assume that something else is going to happen later down the road, but for now, that's part of the Nazi perspective, is to get the Jews concentrated in large cities. Eventually, hopefully, from the Nazi perspective, they wanted to remove them. The initial goal wasn't to kill them, at least from the functionalist perspective. In fact, they thought about sending them to Madagascar, which had recently fallen under German control after they took over France, which Madagascar is a French colony. That plan to make Madagascar a giant colony didn't really work out, because the Germans weren't able to defeat the British. The British still controlled the seas, so there was no way to send ships down to that area. And then you get Barbarossa in 1941. Somewhere along the line, we think either Himmler or probably Hitler himself makes an oral order. Hitler speaks actually to several of these Einsatzgruppen commanders, these squads, these special groups that go out behind the Wehrmacht on the heels of the invasion. And instead of taking more Jews from the Soviet territories that they're now invading into custody and into these confinement, into these ghettos, the decision's made to simply shoot them. And that's really the first phase of the final solution, if you want to, use that language, where 1.5 to 2 million Jews and others are rounded up and shot near their places of home. And this is the experience of the Holocaust for a large chunk of people who were murdered there, is being killed in local ravines, ditches, cemeteries, places they would have been intimately familiar with, near their homes, thousands of mass shooting sites. Now, after Barbarossa happens and this mass shooting phase wraps up, or at least gets moving, there comes this shift with, well, now what do we do with the millions of Jews in the ghettos? And this is where the Wannsee Conference comes in. We, again, don't have a written order. We think that Hitler has made an oral order at some point. Himmler certainly makes the intention known that this is Hitler's decision and Himmler's decision to find a more, quote, efficient way to exterminate the Jews that are remaining. At Wannsee, there's roughly 15 to 17 German officers, the highest ranking probably Reinhard Heydrich, which is where the name Operation Reinhard comes from. He's assassinated shortly after in Prague, and they named the death camp program Operation Reinhard after Reinhard Heydrich. Eichmann is also there. And the goal of Wannsee is not necessarily to debate whether or not this needs to happen. The goal of Wannsee is to figure out how it needs to happen. Again, this is where the functionalist aspect comes in. The shootings are no longer viable. You have all these people in the ghettos near railway lines. And so the decision that ultimately comes from this is to create 3 death camps. And these are facilities where there is no work. There is very, very limited selection. People are literally sent to these places to be killed. This is not in Auschwitz, where there's working camps. There's so many sub camps. These are to be places where simply people are sent to be murdered in stationary gas chambers. And again, that's Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, which are then started to be built in 1942, right after the Wannsee Conference.
Thank you for that. Chad, would you like to elaborate?
No, that was all excellent. I think I would only throw in, because it might interest American audiences, that Wannsee is briefly delayed by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So by the time this happens, just going in the same direction that Jacob was there, I believe that the scholarship has currently kind of come to an agreement on the idea that Wannsee is a disseminate whose job is what sort of meeting. It's not a meeting to decide whether or not they're going to build gas chambers and murder Jews at set place camps instead of those mass shooting sites. So it's more of a, now we're at war with the whole world, kind of all gloves are off. We can take off after this perceived chosen Jewish enemy that they think goes along with their Western and Eastern communist enemies, and kind of just go straight at what they have kind of probably for some time foreseen, depending on where you come down on that debate that Jacob was talking about. But that last piece of the puzzle, the Pearl Harbor attack and the United States coming into the war, just escalates things beyond anything that had been seen to that point.
Yeah, and Jason, if I could, just one more point that Chad actually reminds me of. You know, we do have one set of documents that survived this meeting. They were supposed to all have been destroyed. One of the telling things is, I believe it was Eichmanns List that he made. They are not just planning for the murder of Jews in the territories that the Nazis hold by 1941-42. In this list, they cite 11 million is the number that they give. And they've accounted for English Jews, you know, in the United Kingdom. They've accounted for Portuguese Jews, which of course is not, and it is not part of the Nazi universe. They have actually taken into consideration, and that's how dark I think this Operation Reinhard is. Like Chad said, this isn't something that it's a foregone conclusion that this is going to be the murder of Jews. And the really twisted part, they're accounting for countries they haven't even taken over yet, assuming they will get those countries under their control and have to murder their Jews. So this is really, that's where Reinhard comes in. And that's the dark goal of these camps, is to murder not just the Jews that they've already taken, but Jews that they, you know, technically worldwide.
Yeah, well, the two of you have really condensed an incredibly complicated and atrocity-laden history, already noting there are over 1 million Soviet Jews have been murdered by late 1941. There'll be other sweeps by Einsatzgruppen later, and pointing out that by this point, with the U.S. coming into the war, Nazi Germany declaring war on the U.S., December 11th, that the Nazi regime sees itself in a global struggle to the death with enemies that are dominated, US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, by Jews. And that's a claim for Hitler, Goebbels, Heydrich, Himmler, Eichmann, etc. You could just keep adding the list of these people that simply there's no room for even critical thought on that. Even Joseph Stalin is somehow a Jewish puppet in this worldview. And so it's, I think, important for the audience to remember you have this notion of a global struggle now by the end of 41-42, and then how this is playing out quite locally in Poland with these camps created in what the Germans will call the general government, or government general, depending on how people render it. This area of occupied Poland is under, at least officially, a civilian administration, and yet the SS are running these camps within that, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and where they're going to murder well over 1.5 million people before it's over. So that's really great, I think, in terms of showing us where we're at, giving us a framework for thinking about this. So let's talk about Treblinka, the third. I think Chad's already noted that the third and final of these camps. So if we can use the term operations, we're here saying mass murder. That really begins at Treblinka in July 1942. So some 6 months after the Wannsee conference. And so, Chad, back to you on this one first. Mm-hmm. Could the two of you describe where we're talking about when we say Treblinka, how this camp, whether you want to call it a death camp, an extermination camp, a killing center, there's obviously real debate, not only just academic debate, but kind of ethical debate about what's the right term, the kind of moral term to use about these camps where so many people perish, but how it was set up and administered. And what would you want us to know about the perpetrators that are staffing the camp? So Chad, please.
I think one more thing about Aktion Reinhardt gives us the place to begin this answer. And that's to say that we talked about how the meeting is to disseminate that this is going to happen. Now it's just to tell everyone at that table what their role in it will be. It seems like probably one change might have been made around that table, depending on your interpretation, that the leadership, Nazi German leadership of that general government of occupied Poland, raises its hand at that table and says, this should begin in Poland. We have the largest Jewish population. It seems that is taken on board, and then Aktion Reinhardt, as the outcome of that meeting, is directed right at occupied Poland. So where those three camps pop up then just is a matter of Polish rail geography, population centers, and trying to find some version of, this. Jacob, I think, should talk about this some more, but that so-called secrecy of keeping these places out in the countryside. Secrecy is really a total misnomer, but I'll set that aside. Then when you've decided where these places are going to be, what they are going to do, who's going to operate them becomes a matter of going back to kind of the Nazi tool chest of what they had already done to their chosen enemies. So they've already invented the idea of the gas chamber. They did that at the euthanasia sites, where they took the lives of mentally and physically disabled Germans and others, Poles as well. But they have, because of that program, which many listeners might know as the T4 program, they have a trained cadre of SS men, men that will become SS, who know how to operate these chambers, and they think will be the right people to lead these camps. Up to this point in their lives, they've been medical orderlies or some form of staff around these euthanasia sites. And those individuals, 90 plus of them, are sent east to be the main German cadre at these three camps. All three of them are run on a very small amounts of German guards, and then mostly they have what the sources will either recall as Travniki or Ukrainian guards. But so you'd have 30 or so German SS guards. Those would be the individuals who came from the T4 program, the euthanasia sites, and they would lead. Most of them hold NCO or non-commissioned officer sergeants type ranks, and lead around 120 at Treblinka. These numbers will go up and down over time. But what was called the Travniki guards or the Ukrainian guards, those individuals are taken from POW camps where Nazi Germany had captured a great deal of the members of the Red Army, and they offer them this sort of choice. You can come into German service or stay in this POW camp, which might well mean your death, as 3 million Soviet POWs die in German captivity. So we could think all day long about their levels of anti-Semitism. However, they were definitely anti-Semitic in their own right, but they also just make that decision that leaving that POW camp is better than staying in it. So those are your individuals that run it, kind of where it comes from. Maybe Jacob wants to take over on like the operations day to day, how it functions.
Yeah,
Jacob,
certainly. Thank you, Chad. So, that's an excellent overview of who is running this, who's put in charge. I think, the other thing that Chad mentioned was this idea of secrecy. The location selection of the three Reinhardt camps is very important when examining why the Germans did this, why they did what they did. At the end of the day, they are the ones who created these camps. And so we do have to kind of try to understand that dark logic behind why they did so to figure out, what made them work, how they were designed the way that they were. The goal is really twofold here. Chad mentioned, one of the big ones is it needs to be near a major railway line. know they have large numbers of Jewish populations in the ghettos. They know that most of those ghettos are in major cities near major railway lines. And so they want to find a place that is both accessible, but also isolated, at least from their perspective. And so Treblinka is decided to be right near the critical junction town, railway town of Małkinia Górna, which is about halfway between Białystok and Warsaw. And essentially that is so Warsaw, of course, the biggest Jewish ghetto in all of Europe at this point, with over 400,000 Jews being confined there. And Białystok also has a large population. But they like Małkinia because it's not a very heavily populated town. They have a labor camp there for Poles who are not meeting German quotas, because the Poles are also under the thumb of the Germans. And those Poles are sent to the work camp at Treblinka, which later becomes Treblinka I. It's located at a gravel quarry about 8 kilometers from Małkinia, near the town of Treblinka of the same name. And there's about 700 to 1,000 Poles at this Treblinka I camp since 1939, 1940, who are put in charge of mining the gravel from this area. They're the ones who are then requisitioned and forced to build Treblinka II, what the Nazis feel is out in the middle of nowhere. They see this as an isolated space. They feel like that's important to them. And the reason that's important to them, we have to look further back into the evolution of kind of what's going on here with the Holocaust. The Nazis have learned 2 major lessons along the course of implementing their racial policies. The first was learned on Kristallnacht, this idea that the German people, their reaction to the violence in the streets of November of 1938, their reaction to the violence as German people are assaulting Jews and destroying synagogues and breaking windows, is not that the Germans shouldn't do this to the Jews. Their reaction is, this is publicly disorder. This is something we don't want to see. This makes us look bad. So the Germans, in their mind, the Nazi leaders say, okay, the German people didn't protest that we're targeting Jews. They just don't want to see it. They don't want to get the sense that this is disorder. And you see this with T4 after World War II starts in September of 1940 or 1939. As Chad mentioned, the T4 program, they organized 6 killing sites for the mentally and physically disabled that they start killing by the tens of thousands. And they put these 6 sites in various places throughout the German Reichs. Many of them are in Austria, but that's been annexed. They actually get protests for those too. But again, here, the protest from the German people is not that they shouldn't be doing this, at least for the most part. They do get some of that. But the main protests that make the Nazis really in that program is the Germans in these towns don't want to smell it. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. And so by 1942, by Reinhard, that's the decision to locate these camps in what they feel is isolated, but also is on the frontiers of Poland. This is very much supposed to be part of the Lebensraum of the German Third Reich. And so the Nazis assume that this is okay by the German people. The vast majority of them have not complained that this is done against Jews or people with disabilities. Their complaint has simply been that they do not want to see it, hear it, or smell it. And so their location here in the middle of the general government in Poland, near what had been the border with the Soviet Union up until 1941, that is very, very specific. They don't care as much if the Poles see it, hear it, or smell it, and they certainly do. We know that the camps, create a lot of smoke and smells and sensory witnessing, but they're not as concerned because the Poles are second-class citizens in the German mindset. So that's really the idea behind where to locate the camps and how it fits into Nazi logic.
Great, thank you for the. I mean, that really does clarify, I think, for all of us about the locale of mass death. In this case, it is remote. It's away from major population centers, but it's accessible by rail. And the Warsaw Ghetto, as Jacob acknowledged, is going to be crucial, especially for the kind of early phase of Treblinka. So why don't we shift now to talking about the Jewish experience at Treblinka? We will obviously have plenty more opportunity to talk about Nazi perpetrators and or Ukrainian perpetrators when we get into the uprising. But from where can we say that, from where were Jews deported to Treblinka, and what happened to them once they arrived at the camp? Both of you point out there was definitely resistance prior to August 2nd, 1943. That's obviously our focus here today. But can you give us some insight into these pre-uprising acts of resistance at Treblinka?
Yeah, Chad, would you like to field this one?
Sure. So I think I could talk about how the Jewish experience begins, and that is by getting off the train. I'll talk about a little bit of like how this camp operates to get a basis for that experience. So let's say it's an average day at Treblinka where transports are arriving. Those trains could be 60 cars long, 60 boxcars long, and they'll break it into 3 sections because the railroad siding inside of Treblinka 2, inside of the extermination camp, can take 20 cars at a time by backing it up that line and closing the gate in front of the locomotive. So they'll break it down, they'll do that 3 times. Individuals be forced off that train into an arrival plaza, always making people go as fast as they possibly can. This is a point where I could say maybe it would be helpful for the audience to throw up that 1942 map. And as they're pushing people into that arrival area, people are made to undress there. Men and women are separated. Sources kind of vary on what happens next after that separation of the sexes, and I think that partially that's that experience changes over time. But people are entering along that 14 labeled track. Then they're pushed into through the gate labeled 16. Their men are made to undress outdoors where it says 18, women indoors where it says 20, and then they are pushed up this tube here. I say the word tube because it's sometimes referred to in German as the Schlauch, and then also in their terrible sense of humor as the Himmelstrasse, or the road to heaven. Himmelweg, Himmelstrasse, both of those appear in the sources, but it doesn't take very long, terribly unfortunately, especially once, if you want to pop up the 1943 map, once they enlarge the gas and make a new gas chamber, 6,000 or more human beings can be murdered and their bodies disposed of by lunchtime if they've arrived in the morning. One of the things we learned from Gita Sereni's book is in the former commandant of Treblinka's own words, Franz Stangel's own words, that they would be done by that work by lunchtime. He actually tells her in one of their interviews. So that's how it works, like how Jews experience this, and where resistance can happen. Is really a conversation to start with right from now on this later map, from like the number 25 and 27. So that's this relabeled reception area of the same way. So some Jews arriving at Treblinka do engage in physical resistance immediately on stepping off the train. At least one guard is stabbed to death by a Jew stepping off a train. That guard's name we know for sure. It's probably that the Jew who killed that man was named Meyer Berliner, but that's difficult to ascertain for certain. It's likely, however. So that sort of thing takes place. They attempted a couple of different times to unload trains at night. It seems that there were some mass attempts at resistance when they attempted to unload trains at night, so they stopped doing that sort of thing. But that's, people immediately go to the idea of armed or physical resistance. What also goes on, I think that's necessary to talk about, especially in this arrival area, is how Jews resist in more subtle yet incredibly important ways. So one of the ways that I think they put together their resistance strategy was by taking control of who gets brought into the camp alive. One of the big ways that Treblinka and the other Aktion Reinhard camps differ from an Auschwitz is there's no big set piece selection of who's capable of work and who's not here. If a train of 6,000 people arrives at Treblinka, it would be pretty common for all 6,000 of those people to be murdered. But some days there are openings in the workforce created by one terrible circumstance or another, And it seems that Jews actually standing on the working at the reception area are able to have some influence in who replaces those people. So that becomes a way to pick individuals you trust. And if you already trust them, then you can slot them into a growing resistance conspiracy, and, you know, not have to worry about, in this terrible place of extremists, trying to figure out whether or not you can trust this new person. You pick somebody you already know. And then, you know, it's worth a couple of seconds at least to talk about spiritual resistance, or just remaining who you were. If Nazi Germany intends to murder you for being Jewish and you steadfastly remain so to your final moment, that is also a resistance that deserves to be thought of, I think. So we have stories of rabbis getting off the trains with their congregations and saying the Shema Yisrael, on their way to the gas chamber, because as time goes on, more and more Jews do understand full well what arrival at Treblinka is. That's regardless of the fact that by the time that camp looks like this in 1943, they've already put they've made it look like a train station and tried to lull people into a false sense of security all the way up to the last moments. But as time goes on through, as you know, especially escapees returning to the ghettos and other places in Europe, more and more Jews do know what transport to Treblinka means, and that gives them at least the opportunity to decide if they're going to pray in their last moments, or they're going to attempt to take off after a guard in their last moments, how they're going to live out that end. If they have any choice at all, it's comes down to at least having the information that allows you to make a choice. So that's, I think, how things change over time, how that the arrival works for people. For most of the 900,000+ people who are murdered at Treblinka, it's over in a couple of hours. It's a terribly efficient place. It's horrendous. Maybe I'd ask Jacob if he's also read about this, but I've heard that the new gas chambers are so efficient that they never even use the 5 chambers on the opposite side of the hallway. So if you look at building 35 here in this map, there are 5 chambers on each side of a central hallway, and this place is so able to do what the Nazis wanted to do that it comes down to that they only ever used half of it. But I think that's where I would stop. Just that initial how arrival in the Jewish experience works for the mass of victims that we don't really have the ability to hear their stories. I'm sure that the both of us will talk about experiences of those who lived inside the camp going on.
Chad, thank you. That's just utterly chilling detail and shows something about the entire Nazi mindset, the focus on this level of detail, of organization, of deception, to try to at least prevent people, or at least render them passive, even when they might know what's happening. As you've already pointed out, many people are not passive prior to August 1943. There are various ways they do resist, even up to and just preserving their own sense of Jewish identity. But you can see how monstrous a system this is here, and designed for efficiently murdering people by the thousands every day. Jacob, what would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think Chad did an excellent job of giving the layout of Treblinka, what the Jewish experience was like, what the camp was meant to do. I may just add a few points to kind of help paint the larger picture here. And it is a horrible picture. This is not something that is, fun to talk about by any stretch, right? This is the worst of the worst when it comes to Treblinka. Some of the things that the Jews had to experience in their final moments, or even the ones who were kept alive for a few weeks before also being killed, are some of the worst things I've ever encountered in terms of research. I've made decisions not to include things because they're just too horrific, which is to a larger point here. There are some Jews kept alive at Treblinka. We mentioned earlier, there are no selections here. And that's true for probably most of the transports, as Chad mentioned. There are, it's not uncommon for transports of 5,000 to 6,000 to all go into the gas chambers. The Germans, though, Chad also mentioned that there's only about 30 at Treblinka, and then there's, over 100 probably of these Ukrainian guards. That's not a lot of people to run a camp where you're murdering 5,000 to 6,000 people at a time. And so the Germans certainly don't want to do this work. If you want to pull that map back up, I can make a few pointers there, but the Germans want the Jews to do this work to stay alive. They certainly don't want to get their hands dirty if they can avoid it. But you'll notice the death camp and the living camp, there's a large green space between it. And it looks fairly close on this map, but in terms of geography and layout of this camp, that's as far away humanly possible as the gas chambers and the death pits over there where they're burying people and later burning people. If you go all the way to this far corner here on the lower left-hand side, that's where the commandant's house is. He is removing himself physically as far away as possible from this horrific killing that's going on. He even wants to remove himself. And that doesn't absolve them of any guilt, certainly, but it shows you their mindset that they don't want to do the horrific tasks of this killing process. And that's where you get Jews being kept alive. It's roughly between 700 and 1,000 at any given time. They work in different areas. By far, I would say the most horrific is the ones who are working in the actual death camp area, the extermination area. They're doing things like pulling Jews out of the gas chambers. They're dragging them to the graves. And then later, when the decision is made to burn the bodies, they're doing that work, which is horrifying work. They also are working in the reception area. They're offloading trains. And in fact, if we could move forward, there's a Willenberg map that I'd like to show. Thank you. So if you actually notice this is drawn by a survivor, Samuel Willenberg, who is one of the few survivors that we have of Treblinka. And it shows very well kind of what Chad was describing. Here in the foreground, you have the train arriving, and you'll notice there are individuals standing kind of directing the large groups of people into the undressing barracks there. And those are the Jews that are working in the reception area. These are Jews whose right to live at Treblinka, according to the Germans, is that they are performing the functions of the camp. They are tasked with trying to keep this orderly. But in doing so, they can enact some aspects of resistance. And to put this into a larger perspective, the question that I think a lot of people sometimes have, the misnomer, is that Jews went like sheep to the slaughter, right? That this was the Nazis' goal, that they were going to eliminate the Jews in these efficient death factories. And so the question is, well, why did they let this happen to them? And I think that's an incorrect question. And part of the reason why is the Jews that are being sent here really have the deck stacked against them. In Warsaw, they're being starved to death. They're dying in large numbers of disease in the streets, freezing. And they are told in July of 1942 that this is going to be a resettlement, that they're being evacuated to the east for work. I think, I might even mention the aspect of euphemisms is very important all the way back from Wannsee Conference. They never used the term killing. They used these euphemisms like evacuation. The Jews are told to bring luggage with them initially. They're given bread, sometimes jam, to go on these trains. And within the first 6 to 8 weeks, over 200,000, but by the first 3 months, 300,000 Jews are sent from Warsaw to Treblinka. That is a massive number of people in a very short period of time. And it takes a while for word to get back about what Treblinka actually is. If you look at the map here, you can probably see the train station there. There's a fake clock painted on it. There are arrows pointing to Warsaw and Białystok. It's not called Treblinka. It's called Obermaidan, which is this name that people show up and say, oh, this probably is a transit camp. There are windows for ticket takers in the train station. The Nazis have gone to some lengths to try to make this appear that the euphemisms are correct. In fact, as they're being ushered into this undressing barracks here, they're told to not only undress, but here's a ticket to get your clothes back. Make sure you tie your shoes together so you don't lose one and you just get one back on the other end. And so everything is done to ensure that this is part of this. And so really, once word finally gets back, you have more and more resistance. But the logical thing in the ghetto is when these disheveled survivors who maybe somehow escaped Treblinka or jumped off a train come back and say, don't get on the trains, it's going to a death camp. And the logical thing is to not believe that. The Jews in the ghetto and most rational people at the time would have assumed, well, we're going to be kept alive for work. Why would the Nazis just kill us? If at least we could work for the Third Reich, why wouldn't they put us to work? We know in World War I, some of the horrific rumors coming out about the Germans proved to be inaccurate. And so everything is really working against the Jews finding out about what's actually happening here and being able to actively resist until it's, already the speed of this process is so horrific that by the time the Jews actually start to accept this is what's going on, many of them have already been murdered. And I would say too, that as that happens, you have more and more instances of active resistance, not at the camp per se, but along the train tracks coming along. People are jumping out of trains all along the railway corridors that lead to Treblinka. And that becomes so prevalent that the Nazis have to start stationing guards on the trains to try to prevent these escapes. And you have many people getting murdered as they're jumping out of cars. So the other thing I just want to point out about this map real quick is this deception is something the Nazis are really putting a lot of effort into. They even have flowers around the gas chambers, the original gas chambers disguised as a Hebrew temple. And this is all to reiterate this ruse that this is a bathhouse. This is it's that ironic German sense of kind of macabre mindset here. But underneath all of that, you also have the very real understanding that if people are really paying attention, you can see what's going on here is not probably what a resettlement camp would look like or a transit camp would look like. So the big pile of stuff that you see behind the train shed, behind the undressing barracks, that's actually clothes and shoes and belongings. And that some testimonies say that's upwards of 50 to 60 feet high at some points, because you think about the speed of 300,000 people bringing their belongings. And the Germans encourage this. They want to steal those belongings. That sticks up above the fences. The trains, the people who have a view outside of the barbed wire windows can see those massive piles of clothes. And you can make two assumptions, and you see Jews being very rational about this as they're showing up. Some say that's not good. What happened to the people wearing those? But you also see other conversations in these cattle cars as they're rolling up that, oh, that's going to be our work. We have to get to work on this big pile of clothes, sorting it for the Third Reich. And so you can kind of see that, resistance is one of those things that it's very much an individual on an individual level. It's hard to make blanket statements, and people simply staying alive at Treblinka is a challenge.
Well, this is just an extraordinary amount of detail. And I think our audience really grasps something about the enormity of even attempting to really fight back against a system this totalitarian, this murderous, but nonetheless they did. And so we come to it now, to one of the most extraordinary days in the entire history of World War II and the Holocaust, the Treblinka Uprising of August 2nd, 1943. Just watching our time, we're now kind of down to around 25 or so minutes. So this question, and we'll start, Jacob, with you with this one. If we could be brief on this one so we can really kind of lay out what actually happened during the uprising. What do we need to know about key figures involved in preparing this revolt, and what kind of plan, or what can we say about a plan as such behind this action? So Jacob, and then Chad with this one.
Yeah, certainly. So at Treblinka, like we talked about with the map, there are certain Jews who are kept alive from the German perspective to run portions of the camp. And these are not homogenous group. They are broken up and delineated by their tasks. So you have a group that works in the extermination a part of the camp. We could pull that map, the 1943 map up, if that might help. They, by 1943, are confined to that space. They are not to leave that space, and essentially that is where they are kept for the entirety of their stay. And it's important to note too that these work Jews at Treblinka are also what the Nazis called rotated out with some frequency. They're murdered, especially early on, every 3 to 4 weeks. And the reason is the Nazis want to try to keep this a secret. And that is where you get some more selections and transports that arrive. The Nazis need to replace these work Jews. And so these Jews by 1943, whether they work solely in the death camp or the Jews who work in the reception area, or another group called the Hofjuden, which are the court Jews. These people are the ones who are able to traverse the different spaces. They're the ones with special skills. Janko Virnek, who's a carpenter, is one example. He's one of the few who's allowed to move through different parts of the camp, and he's kept alive. But these Jews by 1943 start to understand that the longest living among them are the ones who've been able to make themselves useful within this system. And if they don't do that, they're going to be killed themselves. And so even life at Treblinka is not really life. These Jews have to work amongst the death camp. They have to work amongst the bodies of the people that they may know, maybe family members, and they know that they are going to be killed as well. So by 1943, the transports are slowing down, and there is this real sense that there needs to be some type of resistance if they're not simply going to be killed as well. It's a kind of a human instinct in some regard. But essentially, you have different plans that start to be hatched. A guy named Galuski is one of the key members here. You also have Janko Virnek, who's able to communicate this message between the different areas. Because again, planning in the reception area or planning in the living camp area can't always be communicated across to the death camp workers. And they're going to be important for any type of revolt aspect. And so people like Janko Virnek, who's able to move throughout some of these spaces on his carpenter duties, is able to spread some of these messages. And I think it's really also important to pair this up with what's going on in Warsaw, because that is where a lot of these Jews come from. And in Warsaw, you have the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of 1943, where, knowing that Treblinka is at the end of the road here, the Jews in the ghetto that are still in the ghetto fight back. They don't get on the trains one day. They've been stockpiling weapons. They've been smuggling pieces of gunpowder from the different working units that they've been on, and they fight off the Germans for about a month. They actually kill around 300 German military men who are trying to come in to root them out. Now, the ghettos burn down. 6,000 to 7,000 are killed. The other 40,000 are sent here to Treblinka or other camps. Actually, many of them are sent off to Majdanek because there's an instance where someone tries to smuggle a grenade into Treblinka, and the Germans come to the conclusion that we probably shouldn't send the same people who are resisting us in Warsaw to Treblinka, or lest it happen here. But the Jewish workers at Treblinka, they use that. They say, well, this is clearly something that the Germans don't want. They don't want us to resist. And they start to figure out, well, so plans are really afoot, probably earlier than this, but at least for sure by March or April 1943, that there needs to be some type of revolt. They set the date for various points. They actually make a copy of the key to, there's an armory on site here in the SS part of this camp where the Germans keep their weaponry. And these Hofjuden actually make a key, a spare key to be able to break into that. And they start to collect weapons. They start to stash a grenade here. Like I said, the one person actually brings a grenade from the Warsaw Ghetto onto the trains. It's also important to know that some Jews that are kept alive here, or the working Jews, are part of the Waldkommando, which is the group that goes around collecting new branches, because the outer tree line here, if you look at the map, there's an open field and there's actually an outer fence. That outer fence is barbed wire. It's not electrified, but they keep it interspersed with pine branches so that no one can see in from the outside. But those die pretty quick. And so there's literally a group kept alive whose job it is to go out into the forests around Treblinka, into the fields, collect new pine branches. And basically replace the dead ones with the living ones. And that's, I think we could have another conversation about how important secrecy is to the Germans, that they want to keep Jews alive to make this happen. But they also start trading with the local Poles there. And the Ukrainian guards can be bribed. They're the guards that are out watching these, 10, 15, 20 Jews who are out collecting tree branches. And we actually know that they are able to get different products from these Poles in the trade. They're able to get money. They're able to get, we think weapons, actually. A few of the weapons that they get are from this interaction. They certainly are able to get food and different things as well. And so all of these things start to come together. And, they actually set a date, June 15th, I believe, 1943. And date has to get moved. It does a couple of times for various reasons throughout the camp, but they know that they need to do something. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Chad to give you his expertise on this as well.
Sure. That all of so much amazing points in there. If we could jump to the Willenberg map, I'm going to show you something that Jacob and I have both come to in our own writing and research on this, that sort of unites us. We came at this not knowing that we were both thinking about it at the same time. This is Samuel Willenberg, a Jewish survivor of the living camp side of Treblinka. His work was not in the area that contained the gas chambers and the burial pits or the pyres where bodies were burned later. So he was not allowed in that side of Treblinka. And if we look at this map that he draws here, map/drawing, the only things that he draws in Camp 2 or that death camp side of the camp are things that he could see over the berm. You see here a fence and then a sand berm going along behind that giant pile of clothing. He draws the excavator. He can see the arm of that above the berm, so he knows that's there. He draws guard tower because he can see that above the berm, so he knows that's there. And then the rest of it, tabula rasa. But if we're looking at the 1943 map, we know what is back there. And it's not that there's no fence, that there's nothing. He draws a blank space where he can't fill in the rest of the details. And this is part of that, how we both come at this research, this spatial problem of putting together resistance at Treblinka. So if you're going to have a revolt that includes everyone, you need to network them together. And that network has to be a network that can actually gain access to space. It has to have people involved that are on both sides of that berm, that know how it works on both sides of that berm. It has to have those Hofjuden, those court Jews, are more privileged or able to move prisoners involved. It has to have everybody working together on the same page about this resistance. And that's something that I try to focus in on quite a bit in my own manuscript, is how do they pull these people together? And how is pulling those people together a question of gaining access to this whole terrible place? Because the Nazis would allow a person to be alive where they sleep and where they work and in between those two places. But if you're found outside of that, you are constituting a threat. You don't just get to go walking around. Never is there ability to just be outside of where you're supposed to be. So we have to instead look at, well, if object A got between points A, B, and C, who did that carrying? What is the network that can bring those 3 points together? And that's how I've looked at putting together resistance in this place. And Galewski, or Galuski, whichever way you want to say it, is one of those people who's important to this whole thing. He's the Jewish camp elder. That's a Lagerälteste is the German term, or camp elder means highest ranking, basically Jewish prisoner inside the camp. And he's in on the resistance. You might have heard it, listeners may hear about how terrible capos are thought of as in much of the Holocaust history. What I think inside Treblinka is that some of them are not people that were involved. Some of them are even more aligned with the Nazis than they are Jews. But the involvement of Jewish leaders in the revolt is pretty darn heavy here. So Galewski, that highest ranking prisoner, he's involved in the resistance. Zelo Bloch is another name that comes up as a prisoner leader who's also part of resistance. Of course, you have Yankel Virnik, who Jacob talked about, who's the construction foreman at Treblinka. So he's a You could use the word capo with him if you wanted to, but he's also part of resistance and a major carrier of information between those two deeply separate points in the camp. Which again goes to that so-called secrecy thing. Once a Jew is in Camp 2, the part of Treblinka that where the gas chambers are, the strong rule is that unless you're Yankel Viernik, you can never go back to Camp 1. You are stuck there for good. And Viernik's skills as a construction worker are the thing that causes the Nazis to break their own rule on that. There's some other amazing ways that they communicate between the two camps. I think one of my absolute favorites that just shows you how brilliant people could be is they would write little messages in Yiddish on the side of a cigarette and toss it over the berm. Germans can't read Yiddish. It's written in Hebrew characters. It's very Germanic language, but if you can't read Hebrew characters, it's completely incomprehensible to you. So you can write in Yiddish on the side of a cigarette all you want and throw that. They also changed Yiddish working songs. You might even harken back to enslaved people's songs in the United States on this same way, communicating messages between each other in song and making the subtleties of song cover up the ability to communicate back and forth over that berm. So Jacob talked briefly about them getting a hold of the key. Part of that was in my work, I think it's because Lagerältester Galewski, Alfred Galewski, helps Jews get the ability to work around that armory. We go back to the 1943 map. I'll point out where that armory is. That is way down at the bottom toward the left here. There's a number 7. There's construction going on in front of that armory on the day of the revolt. These green lines in front of it are actually like decorative flower planters. You have to just suspend disbelief and believe that even in a terrible place like this, the Nazis would attempt to beautify their living area. And in the process of attempting to beautify their living area in the eye of hell, they put Jews on work details in front of that very armory. And they've already got a key, which the story of how they get that key is absolutely amazing. But to keep things in some way brief and get toward this whole rebellion, on the day of the revolt, they've already got their key. They have Jews with construction carts and other tools and impedimenta around that armory, so it kind of distracts. It provides the ability to have a good deal of personnel there without anyone questioning the fact that they're there. And weapons are spirited out using that key on the day of the revolt. And through those networks that gain access to geography, as we both talk about, they are moved into different positions in the camp. And I think I'll stop at the point where when does the revolt begin and how things sort of fall apart but stay together, and let Jacob pick up on that one.
This is extremely helpful. So we're now here right on the day of August 2nd, 1943. So Jacob, if Chad's already given you a cue, if you want to begin, if we can give an overview for the audience about the revolt, what actually happened on August 2nd.
Yeah, so I think, it's important to note the incredible amount of, courage. Almost feels like a disservice to say that word, but the acceptance that this is likely going to mean death. The Jewish workers here that are working together very much collaboratively and secretly themselves, like Chad mentioned, with writing the messages in languages only they can understand, but also being very, very, attuned to keeping the secret. They fully expect to they may well not make it out of this, and they have to come to terms with that. In fact, there's one gentleman who is actually caught ahead of time, and he, instead of revealing the plans and because he knows he's going to be tortured, this is, I believe, in April or May of 1943, he actually takes a vial of poison and takes his own life because he's in on the conspiracy, and he knows what happens to people who are trying to revolt. The person that Chad mentioned earlier, who actually kills a German guard, is tortured horrifically before he's killed in front of everyone. And so they have to accept that this is going to happen. But getting to August 2nd, so on that day, it is a Monday. It is the day after. Sundays are usually pretty slow, so they know it's going to be a slow day. They set the time of the revolt for a certain point in the afternoon after they've done their morning duties. The heat of the August days here in this part of Poland, the Germans like to get everything done by about noon. And so the camp, the living Jews take advantage of that. They set the plan for, I think it's 4:30 in the afternoon. And the idea is that at that point, they will try to set everything on fire. They will try to take their weapons and fight back. And they're aided in this by the fact that after the work is done for the day, Franz Stangl, who's the camp commandant, as well as several other high-ranking SS men at the camp and several of the Ukrainian guards, go down to the Buk River, which is nearby, to take a break, sunbathe, take a bath in the river to get away from the heat. And the revolt itself actually doesn't go as planned at all. In fact, it's launched at least half an hour early when several of the Jews who are carrying cash for life outside the camp, they know they're going to have to either take out the main entrance, or if not, they're going to have to try to fight their way through the barbed wire fences to get out. And again, there are watchtowers here with Ukrainian guards and machine guns. They know this is going to be a fight, but they have planned for life afterwards. They know that the local Polish population may or may not help them, but they know that the money is going to help. They might be able to use that to bribe Ukrainian guards to look away. In fact, we know Ukrainian guards try to escape Treblinka as well to get away from it. And they're caught in the trying to make this revolt happen early on with that money on them. And so they immediately launched the revolt at that point. And it's really kind of this chaotic moment. It's certainly the planning has gone on for months, and that there's a general strategy, but the actual fuse that lights this off is really a spark that, I think shows how they're willing to take advantage of any situation that they get. Chad, I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, one thing that we probably won't get into for time is how many individuals involved in this preparation of a revolt had some form of military experience. And while I would absolutely agree with Jacob about the courage not even being a good enough word for what's going on here, one of the things that we can also say is that if anything, the revolt was a bit overplanned. What takes place at Sobibor is, people may be familiar with that revolt, perhaps also because of the more recent movie that portrays it. This is a revolt that relies on bushwhack tactics. One guard here, one guard there, kill an individual when he comes into a building, quietly take out a mass of the guard staff, and then go into a revolt. Treblinka's planners seem to have much bigger eyes than that sort of plan, and they want to take on guards in a larger, you might even almost say, set piece battle. And the problem that comes down there is that when two individuals are caught with the cash that Jacob talked about, they're starting to be marched over to an area of execution. Prisoners decided, very emotional decision, that no one else was going to die that day until, the actual revolt itself. And they took a shot at the guard who was leading those two individuals to kill them for having cash on them. That set off the revolt. We can look at sources all day long. It's going to be either a half an hour or an hour, or so. It's early, whatever it comes down to this. So it's such a chaotic moment that everybody who recalls it a little bit differently. But regardless, it's early. And that means that not everybody is in the position they were supposed to be. Not everybody has come and pick up the weapon that they were supposed to have. And instead of this being, that Sobibor type revolt of get one guard at a time, when it comes apart like that, it becomes less of some sort of organized battle plan and becomes then absolute chaos. But absolute chaos also works. And there had been an epidemic in the prisoner population before the revolt, so we don't exactly know how many people were probably left alive on that day. But let's say, for argument's sake, 600 were in the camp on the day that the revolt happens. It appears that 300 of them get out of the camp on that day. 200 are probably killed in the process of the revolt happening. It is it's terrible. People are running everywhere. The Germans are still far better armed than even the Jews who have captured some arms from them. And that huge number of individuals killed in the process of the revolt. And German sources that are still, of course, in the camp at the end of the day say that somewhere around 100 work Jews remained in the camp after the revolt. So you've got 300 attempting their escape outside the camp, perhaps 200 dead, 100 still alive inside the camp. These are numbers that you could come up with a lot of different perspectives on, but it's somewhere around these truths. And over the process of the next weeks at the most, but probably hours and days, a good probably about 200 of those, of the 300 who escaped, probably about 200 of them are murdered in the forests as German forces and local Poles go about the process of recapturing, and for the most part, when captured, just immediately shot wherever they had stood at the part of recapture. So that kind of brings you to the end of August 2nd and into the few days thereafter of Nazi German forces kind of coming in from all directions to attempt to recapture these individuals. I work a lot on extending our list of survivors, and I've found some more from the day of the revolt itself, but for the most part, it seems that somewhere around 70 have been identified from the day of the revolt, much more in other ways of survival. And we will never, I want to say, we'll never have a full accounting of how many people survived the day of the revolt, because August 2nd, 1943 is 21 months before the end of the war. So where we have this 200-person gap in our understanding of what happened, those 200 individuals may have been captured the hour after the revolt, and they may have made it to May of 1945 before meeting their death in some other terrible way. They would still be, in my mind, and I'm sure we'd agree, like they would be a Treblinka survivor who died in a later engagement or a later form of Nazi German torture, but we'll never really know the full amount of people who got out on that day because of what time it took place in the war, and the fact that, even in the later years, much of this whole area falls under what becomes the Soviet bloc, and we lose a lot of historical information and knowledge when we could have been doing research there earlier.
Well, these are really excellent points. Just thank you both for giving us some real sense about this uprising. And for those who since we mentioned Yitzhak Arad's book, if you go back to the 1987 book, he estimated about 100 survived from the uprising. So obviously Chad and Jacob are giving us more recent scholarship, and also just acknowledging the fact that it's difficult. It's really difficult to know what some final number of survivors were. And it's August 1943. As you said, the Soviets aren't anywhere close to liberating this area yet. That's 11 months away. So just the fact that if it's 70, if it's 100, if it's in between, that's still an astonishing number of people to have made it that long when you're being hunted to your death by the SS, by Ukrainians. You may be dealing with, Polish anti-Semitism firsthand. So it's still an incredible story. So we're about out of time here, unfortunately. This has been such an incredible conversation. So Chad, I wanted to start with you with this one, and just two questions to you both here is that, first, what can we say about the impact of the uprising? And we do want to be brief here. There's so much one can say. You've already mentioned the Sobibor uprising that will happen in mid-October 1943, but what can we say about the impact this revolt has? And then something here, including, I know both of you have some personal things to share about your own experiences here. Like what does this site, it's a site of remembrance today, Treblinka. What does this site of remembrance mean to you both? So Chad, will you first on this one?
Yeah, I would start with that very recent personal connection, being I've been a professor for 2 years now, despite looking older than a professor who's only been in the job for 2 years. Should I have a previous career in the armies that got me to this game a little late, but I got to teach this summer at Treblinka for the first time in my life. I've been there as a student on study abroad. I've been there to do research. I've been there to see and walk the ground. And this summer I got to actually teach at the memorial that exists today. And for those who've never seen it or been there at all, what you find at Treblinka, and why this goes to one of those questions that's kind of stalked this whole conversation, is the world knows way less about Treblinka because it is not the sort of remaining infrastructure that you find it in Auschwitz. So the huge masses of tourists that go to Auschwitz don't usually also go to Treblinka because all that remains is a memorial. But that memorial, signifies those 900,000+ lives taken at Treblinka, and also this amazing resistance that we're talking about here. I think the importance of that resistance comes down to, showing people that forms of pushing back against Nazi Germany took place in every aspect of the Holocaust, in every point along the way in the Holocaust. People escaped from columns being led toward mass shooting pits. People revolted on trains. People revolted in extermination camps. They rose up in Warsaw. They hid. They saved lives of others. They did everything they absolutely could. And we just still don't talk about resistance enough. This is an amazing instance of it, but we should still, pay as much attention to those who just steadfastly remained Jewish, that thing Nazis hated so much, all the way to the end, if that's all they could do. And I think the last thing I would throw in there is that Treblinka's resistance provides Treblinka witnesses. And we're able to have this whole conversation because they survived and wrote about it, talked about it, went to trials about it, and they convicted. Now the sentences were out of all proportion to what those men had done, but they convicted, I think, making a humanities major do math, but I think it was 96% of their guards that were put on trial were convicted. If you had a trial, Treblinka survivors would show up, and that meant everywhere from Ukraine to a denaturalization proceeding in Miami, Florida. So they would go absolutely everywhere, and they did, and they almost always convicted their guards. So I think that's part of their legacy on this resistance. They continued some form of resistance in the form of testimony and memory all the way up until the last one of the revolt survivors, Samuel Willenberg, passed away in 2016.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. Jake, we're going to turn to you. And Jeremy, if you could show the first image of the memorial site, I think it would really help the audience out as both are sharing something about their experiences there. Thank you. Jacob, please.
Yeah, so I know we're short on time, so I'll try to keep my comments brief because I think Chad and I could probably speak about this all day. But Jason, to your questions, why the resistance is so important, why this revolt is so important, this revolt accomplished really 3 things that the Nazis didn't want with Treblinka. And so it actually flies in the face of exactly what the Nazis were trying to do. The first, Chad mentioned, being Jewish and keeping that identity alive. The second is simply surviving themselves. This is, if we look at the goal of Treblinka, is to kill Jews, is to kill them. And so if you survive Treblinka, if you survive one of these Reinhard camps, you're literally going against what the Nazis wanted, which is good. That's what, that's what the point of resistance is. And in fact, by having this revolt, it gets you to the third thing. We have witnesses, like Chad mentioned. We know more about these camps, and that was against the secrecy aspect. The Nazis didn't want the world to know about these things. And so people escaping and surviving, that actually that blows up the secrecy aspect of it. And why revolt matters, why armed revolt matters, because all forms of resistance certainly matter, whether that someone is simply just staying alive for an extra day, whether they're doing something to sabotage a Nazi armament, whatever they're trying to do. But why the revolt matters. This is the first death camp revolt. This is August 2nd, 1943. Because of that, we have roughly 70 survivors of Treblinka because of that revolt. The initial pulse that gets out might have been 300. 200 are probably recaptured, maybe another 30, but don't survive the end of the war. But we have a chance at having a large number of survivors. Sobibor revolt happens a little bit late after this revolt. You have the same thing, about the same number. We have about 70 Sobibor survivors, the same type of situation. You have this pulse out there. Belzec, the other Reinhard camp, to bring this full circle, there is no revolt. We have 2 survivors. And that is not to say that those people weren't resisting, but by having this type of armed revolt at these other 2 camps, we have a better chance of more people making it to the end of the war. It's simple math. And so at Belzec, you don't have a revolt. You have hundreds of thousands murdered, 2 survivors. And, I think that kind of speaks to the importance of this armed resistance and why this is so extraordinary, both here and at Sobibor. And then to the other point too, with the memorial today, the first time I was here, I really didn't know how to feel. I had been to Auschwitz. I had been to Majdanek. Those are both very well-preserved spaces. You can walk through the structures. You can walk through the barracks. You can touch things. It's very tactile. You go to a place like Treblinka or really any of the Reinhard camps, the Nazis tear these camps down in 1943, early 1944, and the war is starting to go against them. They don't want this to fall into enemy hands. The major gas chambers at Auschwitz have been built. They decided to tear these down. And, I was standing there and I just felt haunted by the space. And that word doesn't really do it justice. But personally, I have no connection to the site. I don't have any, ancestors that would have, been sent there, or I don't have any Polish ancestors. It's a Polish space. I don't have any German relatives. But I was very much affected by that space. And I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to make it real, not so that I could, relive any gratuitous violence, but because I wanted to understand what exactly transpired here. And I think it's very important that we do uncover this details, even if they make us uncomfortable, because those are what the survivors, and they really were survivors, to not only survive Treblinka, for someone like Janko Wiernik, who survived a year and then survived beyond the camp for over a year. These people are really survivors in every sense of the word. They almost always, to a person, take time to note the details of what happened here so that the world doesn't forget what happened in this space. They don't just say that so-and-so was shot. They say that they describe in detail what happened in the horrific aspects of Treblinka. And I think they did that for a reason. They don't want the world to ever question the brutality of what happened in this space. This might have been an efficient killing grounds, but it was not the clean industrial mass murder the Nazis hoped. This was horrific, brutal. Some of the sights that people saw to be able to survive Treblinka is some of the most horrific things human beings have ever done to other human beings. And so, as uncomfortable as that makes us, I think that is, to me, why it's so important to understand what happened in this exact space, so that when we go there today, we can not only honor those who were killed, but we can also reflect on just how horrific it would have been to be in this exact spot now 80 years ago.
Well, the 2 of you have really aided us all in having a better comprehension of something that at some level really defies comprehension. And that this vast scale of mass murder, over 900,000 people murdered in Treblinka in 1942-43, and yet people rose up. And they had been doing so already prior to August 2nd, 1943, but there's this real moment of Jewish resistance that does leave survivors and witnesses, testimony that's helped us reconstruct what happened. And for my part, I would just say, I think conversations like these are a reminder that we need histories that really tie the course of the war, the Nazi genocide and resistance, more firmly together, that there's all kinds of links and connections here that need to have more light thrown on them. And the 2 of you have really advanced us, moved us forward with that. So Jacob and Chad, thank you very much for sharing your expertise today. It has meant a great deal to see this really come together. I want to thank our audience for joining us. I hope you've really gotten something out of this, and that you'll consult our social media to see about future events that you can follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.